Lesia Ogryzko is an expert on Ukrainian defense and security, the long war, Russian information operations, active measures, and geopolitics. She is a visiting fellow with the wider European program at the European Council on Foreign Relations and leads a Ukrainian think tank on security and defense. She's also a board member of Ukraine's biggest expert coalition on the country's reconstruction rise. Ukraine, and previously served as an international civil servant across the UN system dealing with human rights and the coordination of UN agencies in Ukraine. And this, I'm delighted to say, isn't the first conversation on the channel. So if you enjoy this, if you get value from this, please do check out the previous conversation as well. And before we jump in, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel this year, has helped to make it possible, and of course, people who are supporting this project in December and January, which is to help share Ukrainian literature, culture, film, music, and art, especially with activist communities who want to immerse, let's say, deeper into that topic, which I think is super important at this time, not just the kind of kinetic support that we provide to Ukraine. Please do check out the sort of links in the description of this video, and of course the generous and of course, the Steel Porcupine, the makers of that extraordinary documentary, who very kindly supported us to help make this series of interviews. Lesia, welcome back.
Hello and good afternoon, Jonathan. It's great to be back.
It's great to see you there in Kiev with the lights on and the Wi-Fi working, and hopefully it's warm too.
And hopefully the internet will allow us to have a proper conversation.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. Well, let's start, I think, with something that I think is an absolutely pivotal core issue. I'm going to be trying to sort of, collect my thoughts over the next couple of weeks and produce something a bit more structure around this. But it seems to me more and more often I'm seeing narratives that are spread by those who are either aligned with the Kremlin for their own personal interests, their political interests. Those perhaps are what we would term assets, agents, etc., which are being activated all over the place. But this narrative is all about inevitability and surrender. That is the perceived inevitability of Russian victory, the eternity of their imperial project, the inexhaustible supply of their resources. We know none of these things are true. But the way of disseminating that seems to me a way of disarming your adversary before the fight's even begun. You destroy the will of your adversary to actually resist and unite. Am I imagining things here, or is this something that is unfolding now in real time?
No, I think you're very spot on, Jonathan, when you talk about this grand narrative about Russia being invincible. And I think this is indeed the one of the biggest narratives that we as Ukrainians have to fight, because as we understand, war is not happening just on the battlefield in the trenches, but it's also in the minds of people, especially the Western partners that still very much support Ukraine. But of course, we can but mention the war fatigue that is taking place, that is eroding some of the Western aid that we are enjoying as Ukrainians. And I think one of the biggest factors in this is indeed the belief that Russia is invincible. And I mean, you can really you have 1,000 of arguments why this is not the case. You can start with just the territorial. If we look at the Russia-Ukraine war, that Russia has failed to capture Kiev, which was the number one target, let's say, during the invasion of 2022. You can then further extend it to everything that happened since 2014 and look at the Donbass, that you actually see that since 2014 being now 11 years, Russia couldn't capture the whole of Donbass, which is just one part of the Ukrainian territory. You can also talk about the fact that Russia has lost nearly 90% of its pre-war army by 2023. So essentially, during 1 year, they basically depleted everything they had, or most of it, what they had on stocks, and most importantly, their professional army, forcing now military to rely on convicts and on poorly trained, basically as cannon fodder. Then you can, of course, also talk about the Ukrainian asymmetric victories, such as the sinking of 25% of the Russian fleet, a country that doesn't even have a full-fledged navy, I mean, Ukraine. We can also talk about the Kursk operation and the very fact that you can actually occupy parts of Russia, of a nuclear state, and guess what? Nothing happens in return, essentially. Of course, we can also recall in our memories the absolutely brilliant operation Spiderweb, whereby the Ukrainian drone operators destroyed 1/3 of the Russian strategic air fleet. And historically, if we go beyond just the discussions of this particular war, but also historically, if we look at other examples where Russia has lost to smaller countries, the Crimean War of the 19th century, the Russia-Japanese War of 1904-05, than the Soviet-Afghan War. So there are actually quite a number of historical incidents where Russia has lost, and of course also the First World War where the empire fell. And I think just by talking about and looking at these multiple facts, you actually see that Russia is absolutely not invincible, and that if you zoom out the situations of looking at every single square meter and kilometer that is being shifted now back and forth, and you zoom out and you look strategically, you actually see that Russia is absolutely not gaining any traction in this war. And speaking strategically, they did not win and are not about to win in the foreseeable future. And I think this is one of the aspects that both the Ukrainian government, but also the Russian government, are trying to convince the West, especially the US administration. And this is essentially what we see now over the past, let's say, 6 months, is basically a dance between the Ukrainians and the Americans, and the Russians with the Americans, trying to convince the American president, on the one hand, that Russia is invincible, and this is Russia's position, and on the other hand, it's the Ukrainians who are actually talking about these very matters and explaining to the Americans, no, they're actually not the big winners. And this is the lens through which I would actually explain this whole dynamic, starting from the Oval Office, but then also the Alaska meeting, then the Washington meeting, where the Ukrainian president was assembling the European partners and convincing the American president about these very facts. So everything what we are seeing now is essentially about this one grand narrative that you're essentially asking about. Is Russia invincible or not? Ukrainians have proven, and we also have a lot of argumentation about why this is not the case. But of course, we don't have such a tremendous propaganda machine, both internally, but also for the external world, through which we can get all of these messages across. And when you're an ordinary citizen, not really looking into all of those details, and not having the time or willingness to appreciate the depth of this analysis, you might just hear it on a very regular basis that Russia is winning, and eventually this thought soaks in. Now, what we hope is that European partners and our American friends will see things as they are, and that is Russia is absolutely not invincible. And by leveraging all of those instruments that the Europeans and the Americans have together, starting from the banking system, from the oil sanctions, the secondary sanctions, technological exports, et cetera, they could actually push Russia to the negotiation table, because this is the only way how we can get closer to any type of ceasefire or a peace deal, because Ukraine is obviously ready. Ukraine has demonstrated and has constantly been reiterating that we want peace in the first place, but it's basically about Russia's willingness and about Russia understanding that economically they are not coping with this war.
I'll come back to that because, of course, we've had the comments of Steve Witkoff, which are frankly repulsive, that requotes essentially the Kremlin line that they're working so hard towards peace, which anyone who's been under fire from Russian drones and missiles would find that comment not just repulsive, it's also a form of trolling, psychological trolling in the geopolitical arena. But this echo of this idea of invincibility, if you sort of parse the language and positions and not just look at the tone, which a lot of coverage is looking at Trump's tone, but not realizing that actually some of the things he says are echoed throughout Europe, obviously put into different language, different formats, but essentially it ladders up to the same thing. So when he says Ukraine has no cards, and President Zelensky is sitting there dumbfounded because he knows that Operation Spiderweb is about to be unleashed, and he's like, we have the cards. We have plenty of cards. I'm not going to show them all to you, but we heard that just this last week from the Belgian premier. Whereas, even though they were involved in the idea of freezing Russian assets permanently, so they don't have to be rolled over. I mean, last time we spoke, we were bemoaning this fact that every 6 months, they had to be rolled over. That's been solved. But still, this idea of fearing Russian retribution in all its different formats, that is translated into a sort of self-justifying language by the Belgian premier, basically saying nobody in Europe believes that Russia can be defeated. No one really believes. And then we have Orban, who is, much more adjacent to the Kremlin, saying the same thing, but in far more, let's say, direct and again repulsive language. So it seems to me that this narrative of inevitability is transmuted and translated in many different ways, and there are many different coercive tools used to get people to internalize it, from the very formal, geopolitical kind of language right down to the crudities of Orban and Trump. But it is essentially, just facets of the same, the same object.
Very much agree with you that this is not just the Americans, and we increasingly see that among some of our European friends. And I think this is not just about fearing retributions. This is indeed about the fact that many, or at least some circles in a number of European countries are still thinking that we can put an end to all of that and go back to basics. We can go back to business as usual. And the thinking is we can start trading with Russia again. We can start building joint ventures, going even back to energy infrastructure projects, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we will be facing in 2026 and onwards, in trying to remain a united Europe that will have more or less a coherent, a united Russia strategy going forward. Now, also going back to the financial question that you have also raised, and about Russia's bluffing. And I think this is what we will be seeing in 2026, will be in their negotiations with the American partners, trying to demonstrate that they are doing very well economically. Now, what our research shows is that during the 4 years of war, the Russian economy experienced a significant imbalance between revenue and expenditures. And this comes down basically to two main factors. One is obviously the large scale increase in military spending, and we see this increase with every year becoming bigger. And the second is obviously the sanctions imposed by the Western countries, which is a barrier to the export of energy. Now, as a result of these two factors, you have Russia that has significantly exhausted and really depleted most of its financial resources. And I'm talking about the gold reserves, I'm talking about the treasury, and I'm talking about the National Prosperity Fund. Inflation is really on the rise. There are alternative estimates, not looking at the official numbers because we for obvious reasons, are not believing the Russian economic estimations. So those alternative estimates that I have seen talk about an inflation rate of roughly 20%. And various renowned Ukrainian and international experts are talking about a stagflation in Russia since 2024. And stagflation is basically a high level of inflation and very low economic growth combined with high unemployment. So this is essentially what is happening in Russia. High unemployment, low economic growth, and very high inflation. You already see parts of this stagflation really in some of the regions when they are shifting to a 4 working day working week, which is not because they are so productive, like for example, Nordic countries that have shifted to a 4 working day week. But this is due to the fact that they really need to cut expenditures. So I will not go into perhaps a lot of the economic discussion here, but as a result, we really see that the federal budget of this year, 2025, will be extremely higher than the last 10 or 12 years. This is at least what I saw in the latest economic estimations of various renowned economists. Roughly talking about 130 billion US dollars. So this is a really big sum of money that the Russians don't know how to handle. Now, what does that mean for Ukraine, and also what does that mean for the negotiation process going forward? First, this shows that economic sanctions did work. And this is also part of this narrative that the Russians are trying to spread among Western countries, using, by the way, one of the channels, the Russian opposition. I don't know whether that is coordinated or not, but listening to quite a number of representatives of the Russian opposition, the so-called Russian opposition in the West, you see this as one of the points that they tried to constantly repeat. Stop the sanctions. They did not have any influence, etc., etc. No, economic research now during these past 4 years actually show no, economic sanctions did work, and you just need Europeans. I mean, you just need to step up and be more coherent in leveraging all of those tools and all of those cards that Europeans have on their hands. Number two, there are weak spots in Russia now. You have huge inequalities that rise from those economic problems and challenges that they have. Not just the inequalities between center and periphery, that has always been the case. It has been just exacerbated by the war, but also inequalities that there is a fairly small amount of people that are benefiting from the war, and the rest of the society that are not. That creates also frictions in the Russian elites. So you have a lot of different weak spots that you can potentially exploit in order to further weaken and destabilize Russia. Now, Russia in 2026 will be at a crossroads of either you feed your society or you have to feed the war machine. Of course, the Russian leadership is not interested and not caring about its population. So obviously, in that equation, most of the money will be going to the war machine. That means that Russia will not all of a sudden crack down and say we don't have the resources of funding our production, et cetera, et cetera. But they're now on a plateau. If we saw absolutely a decrease over the last 3 years of their defense production, now they reach this plateau, and we will see now whether it will be decreasing in 2026 or just remain that. But given the fact that the money is absolutely scarce, they will be pouring everything they have in the defense production. That means that in the society and in the elites, there will be more cracks. So this is just to say that Russia on its side will be bluffing to the end. This is one of those moves in this dance that I'm referring to when I'm saying that the Russians are trying to please the Americans and convince them of things, etc. But the more into 2026, the more of these weak spots we will be seeing being more demonstrated on the surface. And this is then a moment for us Ukrainians and also the Europeans to really hit at these weak spots if the Europeans are brave enough to do that.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to dig into that more detail in future conversations there. What's also interesting is where they choose to spend their scarce resources, because technically there's a lot of stuff going into, refurbishing equipment. Technically, there's a lot of stuff going into recruitment, but we also know that certain obolists are already not being paid, and money is not being prioritized towards their budget. So they're no longer got the resources to do the sort of recruitment at scale that was done last year. I'd be interested to learn whether they are still pouring money into the informational and hybrid operations, because it's always struck me that Putin has a very surgical dictatorship and surgical aggression, almost functioning like a sort of marketing mindset, which is what is having the biggest impact, and you put your budget towards what is having, demonstrable effect. In that sense, I think he's far more rational, unfortunately, than he's given credit for. Irrational, obviously, in other ways, and the big picture is completely irrational. Are they still tipping money, therefore, into sabotage, so-called hybrid operations, information operations? And if they are, does that tell us that actually they feel that these are effective?
Look, the answer to this question is very simple. The Russians don't distinguish between a kinetic warfare and the so-called sub-threshold warfare, which is usually described as hybrid. So they don't have though this distinction that we in other countries usually do. If you look at the Gerasimov doctrine, this is very blatantly put there. And maybe this is a good moment now to advertise a little bit the product. One of the products that we have just launched in our think tanks is the Sahaidachnyi Security Center, and we have launched a hybrid warfare tracker. We called it the Everywhere War. Which essentially is a map where you can, by using different filters, countries, time frame, and also the different types of hybrid warfare or sub-threshold warfare, you can see the trends. You can build your own graphs, etc. And we look at everything that we could found open source since 2022, since the invasion until now, of Russian hybrid warfare operations against all European and all NATO countries. And you can see there a very understandable increase with every new month, especially during those couple of last months since July, August, September, which means that when the Russian leadership will be thinking about whether they have to invest in the population, in social welfare, etc., or the conflict or the war. It's going to be absolutely the latter. And then within the latter, you will invest in defense production, in salaries, conscription, etc., as much as you do on the sub-threshold warfare, including information operations, including psyops, that unfortunately the Russians are very active and very successful in. Something that we constantly discuss with our international partners is when European countries will finally understand that these sub-threshold operations are basically a declaration of war and will shift from a defensive mode into an offensive posture, allowing them to switch on a more wartime thinking, which is then accompanied by other processes that you would not use during peacetime, which would allow psyops operation, etc., etc. If that is not the case, then at least support the Ukrainian efforts that are doing that. There are multiple ways and multiple actors on this front, but as long as the Europeans and also the Americans will not understand that that the war has started, you're just losing time, because there is, if you look at the Ukrainian internal discussion, there is no discussion about whether the war will extend beyond Ukraine's territory or not. This is a no-brainer. Everybody understands that. There was a recent interview with the head of the military intelligence of Ukraine, who stated that while we were operating under, let's say, a deadline of 2030, this deadline of a potential assault and attack on other European countries, including NATO countries, is now shifting much closer to 2027, which means we collectively, and some particular European countries, and I will not be very creative in saying that we are first and foremost talking about the Baltic countries. So we don't have much time, and the more we drag our feet now, and the more we say that this was yet another, a violation of our airspace by a couple of drones, and thanks God we have our F-35, etc. The more we're losing absolutely precious time that we have less and less.
And before we get on to the cultural bit, I wanted to just dig into this because I think you've written very compellingly about this idea that we tend to, in the West, when dealing with Russia, we tend to look at things in a very episodic fashion. And that is both in the broad sort of strategy overview, but also in terms of incidents. So you have Skripal, you have various poisonings and events. You have the invasion of Georgia, you have Crimea, Donbass. But these are all seen as episodic moments rather than laddering up to a broad trend of Russian aggression, Russian expansion, and a historical process playing out. This also perhaps, as you've just described here, is we call it sub-threshold, we call it cyber, we call it this and this and this, and it's a way of compartmentalizing Russian aggression so that actually we don't have to face what is rather a terrifying prospect, that actually all these things, these events, but also these strategies are part of a continuum of warfare.
No, absolutely. We see this trend since 2007. We very often tend to say that the Russians are liars. They are the ones spreading disinformation, false news, fake news, etc., etc. But there is one thing that usually happens is when you listen to much of the public speaking of Mr. Putin. Western audiences very often don't listen carefully, and very often it is the case that when he says something, he actually means it, and then the delta between voicing something and something really happening is very often not years but months. this has been the case since 2007, when there was this famous speech of President Putin during the Munich Security Conference, when he was essentially challenging the world order that we were in back then. It should have been the first red flag for most of our Western partners. But I think this red flag has been raised too late, and only in retrospective, this speech has been then been raised to such high levels and being analyzed. However, there have been so many other red flags thereafter. After 2007, you had 2008, Georgia. You had even before, even in the 90s and beginning of 2000s, there were a lot of early warning calls vis-a-vis their rather aggressive, I mean, the Russian rather aggressive foreign political stance, especially vis-a-vis the former USSR territories. One of the myths, by the way, since we've been talking about myths and grand narratives today, one of the myths that the Russians are also very much exploiting is about Ukraine, that Russia has waged this war in 2022 because Ukraine was so active on its NATO track, that Ukraine sought NATO membership, etc. Now, if you look at the chronology of developments, you would see that in the 90s, there have been quite a number of incidents in Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet, the Tuzla incident of 2003, when the Russians started to build a dam from the Russian territory to Ukrainian Tuzla in order to shift territorial borders between Ukraine and Russia. Then for various reasons in 2010, Ukraine legally enshrined its non-alignment status, which was but this is a part that is being very often now cited and discussed as one of the red lines of the Russians. Now, Ukraine since 2010 had this non-alignment status. And then after we were for 4 years this neutral country, guess what? 2014, Ukraine, Crimea gets annexed. Russia starts a war in Donbass, so attacking a non-aligned neutral country. And it's been only after that, after we have been attacked and part of our territory has been annexed, that in 2014 Ukraine's parliament decides to return to its NATO integration status. So if you look at chronology and you look at it, also other factors such as a very deep cooperation between Russia and NATO, about the Swedish Finnish now example since 2023 2024, increasing the border between NATO and Russia multiple times, you see that this is absolutely nonsense in terms of thinking that Russia invaded Ukraine because it sought NATO alignment. So this is just another example of how Russia basically tries to disseminate these absolutely false narratives. But also going back to the fact that it's not just since 2007 or 2008 when Georgia happened that Russia started to be very aggressive. We can shift this timeline early into the 90s, and you will see that it has been frankly very aggressive from the start. And I think it was just the strategic mistake by the West, which I from a human perspective very much understand. You finally want to turn the page. You finally want to start a new life where former foes are friends again, and we can all live in a Fukuyama created world of peace and prosperity within all.
It sounds lovely. It sounds like some kind of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory kind of scenario, doesn't it? But unfortunately, in the real world, Russia is your neighbor and indeed is Europe's neighbor, and things turn out very differently. Well, there's 100 million themes we could explore, but I think this idea of siloing and the fact this is a continuum war rather than episodic, and until we actually recognize it as such and deal with it strategically, then we are going to be faced with support for Ukraine, which doesn't ladder up to victory, which simply ladders up to survival, which I think is unfortunately what is in the mind of most Western governments. And now, of course, we have the rumor or the announcement that Macron is going to try and find new ways to engage in dialogue with Vladimir Putin. So 4 years in, and we are back to this idea of dialogue with a yes, well, we know what he is. But we'll have to cover that in a separate conversation because I do want to leave a little bit of time to talk about your choices for what you would want to share with people about Ukrainian literature. Do you have a book, maybe an artist or a musician, or a film that you think would be especially important for people who want to engage with Ukraine as a topic, that they should really indulge in that over the Christmas period, especially people who are sort of activists who've been supporting Ukraine, but I think now is the time to to go deeper, as it were, and immerse oneself into what it is that Ukrainians are fighting to protect.
It's really difficult just to find one book that would explain those
You can
absolutely
mention a
different.
few. If you can't stick to
Uh,
one, you can mention a few if you.
Great, great. But I would definitely recommend one of my favorite authors, Ukrainian authors, and that is Oksana Zabushko. Um, she has written, and I would recommend perhaps her last two books. The most recent is Nasha Europa, in Ukraine, in English, that's Our Europe. And the one before that, that she's written, I think, during the first couple of months of the full-scale invasion, is my longest trip, Najdovsha Podorож. Now, Oksana Zabushka overall is one of the most prominent Ukrainian authors, Ukrainian public intellectuals and figures, not just actually in Ukraine, but in the modernity itself. And she is very often like my moral compass. And what I like about her, that she is very active on social media, and she often reacts to things. And this is great when you have a moral compass that is still living, and you whatever happens in our country or globally, you can very often just having your own considerations and thinking, but you can sometimes peek into the Facebook page of Oksana Zabushko and see, what does she has to say about it? And I think this is great to have and to cherish artists and public intellectuals for what they do now, and to have this opportunity to share the same historical moment with them. When it comes to her books, what I like about this last book of her, Nasha Europa, Our Europe, is that it's essentially a conversation of Oksana Zabushko with the United Europe, where she is talking about the phenomenon of Europe, of whether a united Europe could actually exist. What are the unlearned lessons, I would say, of the 20th century? It's a essay collection, so it's a number of essays that she has written predominantly since 2022. So this is very much a reflection of what is happening now in Ukraine, of a war-torn country. But it's also a conversation that she has with prominent European writers such as Paul Celan, then Milan Kundera, Czeslaw Milosz, to things that they have written over over the 20th century, some in the 21st, and this is an attempt to convince Europeans about the role of Ukraine in shaping a joint European future. So this is very much a recollection of what has been the unlearned lessons, but this is also a projection of how we can picture Europe going forward. And I think this is just so important, also geopolitically speaking. Now, we as Europeans are at a crossroads. There are so many speculations about whether we are entering a multipolar world or a unipolar world or some other forms. And Europeans are often regarded as sidelined in these conversations or not having a one soft power or one other parts of power that they can leverage to be that leader of 2020 of the 21st century. And I think her remarks and her thinking is very much about how this could materialize.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to put that in the description so people can sort of follow up with that. And of course, other works. Not all are in English yet, but there's quite a few there that people can choose from. Is there a film? People find it very difficult to choose films and artists, actually. A lot harder than it was to choose authors, but I don't know if anything comes to mind.
I think it's so. I have to confess, I don't have a lot of time to watch movies, although I know of a number of really good movies that have entered the landscape now. One of the most recent is Cuba and Alaska that I have watched. This is of course a movie about the current war, and I think one of the best movies currently produced in Ukraine is obviously a reflection um, about war versus the humanity as a principle. And this is essentially a story of two paramedics, and I think this is just a celebration of life, a celebration of dignity and also humor that very often rescues Ukrainians in those very horrible conditions. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put that in. I've managed to discover that, so we'll put that link in. It's one that I wasn't aware of, but now we'll follow up. Now, I know you have to get on. I'm sure we could probably talk for many hours. I don't know if we'd carry all the audience with us for that, but it's been fantastic catching up with you, Lesia, and your work is obviously very much appreciated. Your clarity and insights into the aggression that Ukraine is the victim of and what needs to be done to push back and triumph against it.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Jonathan. Thank you for everything you do for Ukraine, including with this podcast. And I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and all the successes for all of us together, Europeans, in 2026.
And to you too. Thank you so much. I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by The Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Bucha massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
The Ukrainian people are very resourceful and they're very determined, and they've got a very good reason to be determined. You know, Russia wants to exterminate the Ukrainian nation and just enslave it and absorb it. So they've got every reason to do everything necessary to win this war.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.